Today on Uncommon Knowledge are 2.3 billion people coming after us.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today is the United States losing its competitive edge. Consider a couple of statistics. First, population. The United States, 290 million. India, 1 billion. China, 1.3 billion. Now, average rates of economic growth from 1991 to 2001. The United States, 3.3%. India, 5.4%, and China, 9.8%. Are we about to be eaten alive? Joining us, three guests. Stephen Moore is president of the Club for Growth. Peter Thiel is president of Clarium Capital Management and a co-founder of PayPal. And Craig Barrett is chief executive officer of one of the nation's leading high-tech companies, Intel. Columnist Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, quote, "We are actually in the middle of two struggles right now. One is against the Islamist terrorists in Iraq and elsewhere, and the other is a competitiveness and innovation struggle against India, China, and their neighbors. And while we are all fixated on the former, we are completely ignoring the latter." Close quote. Are we indeed engaged in a dire economic struggle with India and China? Steve?
We are in an economic struggle with China and India, but we're winning, and we're going to win. We're well poised in the 21st century to be number one.
Peter?
It's complicated. We are in a struggle. We're doing well, but it's not a slam dunk.
So far, we're grading it. Now you have to say we're in the struggle and we're losing. How do you see it?
We're in the struggle, and it's a struggle.
All right. GDP per capita, India, $470, China, $900, the United States, $35,200, which leads me to ask Craig what he's so worried about.
Those are gross numbers. China's dividing by 1.3 billion people. If you look at the Chinese middle class, the Chinese educated middle class, they have a higher standard of living, a higher per capita income, and education, which is comparable to much of the United States. And we're talking,
how large is that middle class?
We're talking about several hundred million people.
The Chinese middle class of several hundred million people has already caught up to the American middle class? Is that
on relative purchasing power, yes. Absolute dollars, no, of course.
But they live as well as we do.
They live as well as we do, and their cost of living is less. But I don't think that it's the average income you ought to be focused on. It's the average education level that you ought to be focused on.
Okay, a couple more economic statistics here. Average rate of economic growth from 1991 to 2001. India, 5.4%. China, 9.8%. The United States, 3.3%. How can we possibly be winning?
Well, the fact that China and India, I agree with Craig, that they are catching up. I don't agree with them that they have a middle class like we do. They're still substantially far behind us, but they are catching up. And I would say, Peter, that's good news for the American economy. The global economy is not a zero-sum game. It's not as if as China gets richer, that therefore we have to get poorer. And just look at it this way. Imagine that Craig is right, and that over the next 20 years you see this acceleration in incomes that you've seen over the next 10 years. That's going to mean you're going to have 1 billion Chinese consumers that are going to start buying automobiles and cellular telephones and all and movies.
Keep going
all
until you
of
get
these
to
things,
Intel processors.
Intel processors. And that's huge.
They are already our second largest customer.
China.
China has passed Japan.
Where's India rank?
Oh, India is farther down on the list. They're about 5 years behind China in terms of consumption. But China is the second largest customer for companies like Intel, biggest customer for cell phones, second biggest customer in the world for computers. They're already there. It's not
good for your company.
It's absolutely.
Well, I think that part of it is very good. But there are parts of the world that actually do resemble more of a zero-sum game. One of the big ones is the oil industry, which is dominated by Saudi Arabia. And basically, as China demands more and more oil, it's now the second largest. It's the second largest oil importer in the world today, right after the U.S. Its oil prices are going through the roof. They're at record highs today. and they're probably going to go much, much higher.
Let me ask
and
one
that's
more.
going to help the Islamic terrorists that are the first part of the freedom quote you started with.
1960s, there were plenty of economists and businessmen who were worried about the Soviet Union, that we'd lose out to the Soviet Union. 1980s, they were worried we'd be overtaken by Japan. I cannot omit to mention that your predecessor, Andy Grove, and others in Silicon Valley kicked up such a fuss that against his better judgment, Ronald Reagan signed that 1986 semiconductor agreement. We did just fine against the Soviet Union. We did just fine against Japan. What is different about or distinctive about the present moment?
Size and scale.
China and India are just much bigger.
Japan has a population half the U.S. They have a average wage rate, which is comparable to the United States. It was a very gentlemanly competition between the two countries, if you will. We could compete on merits, compete on capabilities. You're now talking about a country with 4 times the population of the U.S., education of a great fraction of its people, appreciable fraction of its people, comparable to the U.S., at wage rates which are much, much lower.
The key point is that in the 1970s, in the competition with the Soviet Union, one of the reasons the U.S. ended up prevailing was because people were focused on it, and they were really scared to death. If you think about the...
So what exactly do we need to fear from the Asian economies? The prosperity of China, you've already said you're already your second customer, so there's a sense in which if the rest of the world gets richer, so what? Isn't that better for billions of people?
Yes.
Yeah. So what do we fear?
On the one hand, increasing the customer base is excellent for the United States. Second hand, there is competition. There's competition for value-added jobs, engineering jobs, technology jobs. If I think we have anything to fear, it's that innovation engine which is growing in Asia. And it's growing in Asia at the same time. I wouldn't exactly say it's atrophying, but it's not growing rapidly in the United States. So there's a relative growth disparity between innovation in Asia, investment, education, talented workers, market development, which is going to be in competition with U.S. companies going forward. That's what I fear.
But surely, if there's one thing that's not a zero-sum game, it is knowledge and development and science. As people learn more, it's not like it's a zero-sum game. That's the thing that I think can be a win-win situation. The things that are not win-win situations are the oil situation and the larger geopolitical situation, because if the U.S. has the largest economy in the world, then we can also support the largest military, and that creates security in the U.S. If China ends up with the largest economy, we better hope that China is a free and democratic country.
So you're worried about a geopolitical challenge.
That's the long-term challenge.
Let me address that, Peter, because I think it's really what we're after here.
So far we have 2 separate fears, 2 separate things to be afraid of.
Well, the point is that, if you look at the struggle over the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was, is freedom and free markets going to work, or is it going to be central planning? The American model or the Soviet model?
Models.
And what's going on in these countries like China and India, even Mexico is starting to move towards American-based economies, is our model, the American model, the freedom model is working. So when it gets to this issue of the geopolitical struggle that you were talking about, Peter, as long as China keeps moving towards economic freedom and political freedom, then I'm not sure we have so much to worry about.
Well, the issue is whether they can have economic freedom without political freedom.
It is, I agree.
China's copying not Hong Kong, but Singapore. They want to be like Singapore.
Right.
Not so much. Not particularly, because, as pointed out by both the other panelists, capitalism is one, and economy trumps all going forward.
You presume then that as China continues to open its markets and that economic development will tend to bring in its wake freer political, and to the extent they become more democratic, they become less challenging to us.
You see it every day. China's entered the WTO. If you look at business startups, entrepreneurship, all you have to do is go to China if you want to see the leading edge on this. We are the biggest high-tech venture capital company in the world. Half of our investments on a run rate going forward are in Asia.
Are you investing? You run a hedge fund. Are you investing in China?
We're not investing in China at all. We think that it's still a very corrupt political regime, and that it's basically going to be a game where the insiders are going to make out like bandits, and the outsiders are going to do very well to get their money back. But I think Craig's larger point is well taken, which is they have a powerfully growing economy. However, I would not be so sanguine about decoupling that from the political issue, because there was a communist model that failed and a capitalist model that succeeded, but there was also a fascist model which failed only because of World War II. The economies of the fascist countries in the 1930s were actually doing quite well.
Craig is suggesting economic freedom is more important. China will come along. And Thiel here is saying, oh, wait a minute, they could become a rich economy and still threaten us.
It's a danger. I agree with them, except I'm not quite as pessimistic as I am. I guess I believe that freedom creates its own momentum, Peter, and that is...
If you start with economic freedom, you'll end up...
Right, they're going to start demanding political freedom. Because you're exactly right. I mean, I've been to China. They don't have political freedom in China. There's still incredible repression going on.
They don't have it in Singapore either, which is 30 years ahead of China.
Incidentally, just to be fair, let's flip that last question around. Why shouldn't we be worried? Against our population of 290 million, you've got India, they've got a billion people. China's got 1.3 billion people. You've got 2.3 billion people who in the last decade and a half have gotten with the program of capitalism, free markets, international trade, and so forth. Okay, is it good?
Yes.
Those 2.3 billion people are, at least initially, willing to work harder and for less money than many of our workers, and it doesn't seem to me at all implausible that their knowledge workers will be harder working, willing to take lower wages than ours. Why should we be afraid?
Because
why should American
this is
American
what's
wage
been
earners be
happening in the American economy for the last 50 years. Is the low-wage jobs are leaving the U.S. They're going to places like, Korea and China and so on. But where we're winning, I think, is in the high-wage areas of industries like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals and financial services and banking. And so this is where I think Craig and I are in fundamental agreement, though. The one scary thing out there is that our education system is lagging so far behind in the sciences and engineering and so on that we're not going to be able to create those high-paying jobs if we're putting out people from college that can't even read their degree.
The three things that you ought to worry about. One is education, and if you want a higher standard of living, on average, you have to have a higher education level, be more productive.
Okay, you name the three, and we'll talk about each one of them.
The second one is the United States government, which is the premier investor in basic research and development, has to continue to worry about this problem and continue to invest in R&D. If you look at the investment in the physical sciences, engineering areas that we operate in, that's been flat or in decline over the last 2 decades. NIH has gone up funding, but if you look at the rest of engineering and technology, it's down. Right. And the third thing is, I'd correct one earlier comment you made. You said there are 2.4 billion people. Add Russia and Eastern Europe and the other Asian countries. Right. Half of the world's population just entered the free economic system. Half. And if you don't think there are going to be dislocations and changes when half of the world's population all of a sudden, over a short period of time, jumps into the world's free economic system, you're crazy. And the government here and the people here and the education system here have to recognize that and respond to it.
One of the problems is that we know what needs to be done long-term in the U.S. You need a better education system. We need to be focused on competing where we can and working together to create win-win situations. The problem is that in the short term, there are a lot of quick fixes like steel tariffs, like various protective tariffs and things like that. And I think the short-term benefit versus long-term cost is one of the main...
The short-term impulse is almost always protectionist. Right. And that has to be opposed.
And it's a political problem in the U.S.
You're a free trader.
I'm a free trader.
Okay, good. We have no
75% of my company's business is done outside of the U.S. I'm a free trader.
All right. This is what everybody is so concerned about who's listening to the show is, oh my God, my job is going to be outsourced to China or India or
Russia. How do you
Russia.
answer somebody who's worried
And
about
I would say, look, we are still a country that imports capital from the rest of the world. We're importing hundreds of billions of dollars of capital from the rest of the world into the U.S., which is building plants.
Which is to say that people abroad still consider this country the best place
good investment climate. So
investment.
not only do we have to do the things that Craig and Peter were talking about with respect to education, but I would say, look, let's go to a flat tax. Let's move towards
all right, hold on.
Those
Craig Barrett has 3 issues on his agenda. Let's look at the first, education. Craig Barrett, writing in the Wall Street Journal, quote, economists have long predicted that education will be the fuel that drives the global economy. Well, many nations have already begun to rev their engines while America's is stalled. Close quote. Explain yourself.
If you look at the educational performance of young people coming out of the K through 12 system, there's no other way to describe it than we're at the bottom of the barrel. We talk more about education in this country and do less about it.
Primary education. Doesn't the picture tend to reverse when you look at secondary education?
We have the best secondary education system in the world. American universities are still at the top of the pile. Now, there's going to be more competition going forward from places like China, but our university education system is still superb. The problem is, in the K through 12, we do an excellent job filtering people out, filtering most of the people out from wanting to pursue jobs in technology, engineering, science.
Give me your number one reform.
Well, can I have two?
All right, all right.
I'm an engineer. I can't solve a problem unless I measure what I'm trying to solve. So quantifying the performance of the education system, essentially what's in No Child Left Behind, is appropriate. You have to measure the problem. The second one is we need to do a better job preparing teachers to teach topics in K through 12, and especially in the area of mathematics, science, and engineering.
How? Government mandates that?
The government can mandate it. The government can catalyze it. The government can make grants to people to major in those subjects, can forgive college loans if they teach in those areas.
All right.
You need to have math and science teachers who are certified in the topics they're teaching, not what we have today.
Peter, reform education for us.
Wow, that is a tough one. You know, I know when I was at Stanford in the late 80s, we're talking about school vouchers. I still think that would be a good idea.
You're nodding?
Absolutely.
You just gave us a couple of government programs. He's giving us a kind of free market program here.
You only gave me two selections.
I still think it's a good idea. At the same time, I think it's been 20 years, and there's been a whole generation. We knew it was a good idea 20 years ago. So you know, it's a tough problem. The silver lining. Here's
our constitution and patience.
The silver lining. Well, 20 years is a long time. The silver lining that I would give you is, while I agree that education is important, a perspective to keep in mind is the U.S. is able to do far more with less educated people. So if we compare us to Japan.
Right.
Japan has an education system that is second to none, and yet
still lower worker productivity.
And less product because people are forced into one particular job for their entire lives, a big company mentality, and we don't have that in the U.S.
I'm not quite as pessimistic about about the education of our kids. You're right, the education system is totally broken. But one of the things that excites me, just watching my own kids and their friends and so on, we're a middle-class family. Every kid has a computer. I mean, Craig, they're learning stuff on their computer.
They have Intel processors.
They have Intel, you know. So you don't even need schools anymore, practically. I mean, these kids are learning everything they have on their computer set. So that's one reason I'm not quite as pessimistic. And the other thing is, you're exactly right.
Seriously to assert that the high-tech revolution will take care of the problems in our schools? Is that what you're saying?
I think that technology is having a hugely beneficial impact on the ability. Look, I mean, in the future, you're going to have schools that are like virtual schools, where you have, you know, your personal computer in front of you, and you're learning from the best professor in economics.
That'll keep us ahead of China and India?
I think it will. The other thing we haven't talked about, which I'd add to Craig's list, is we have one advantage over all these other countries that you didn't mention, Craig, which is we can import this human capital, which other countries can't. Okay. We can take the best minds of China and India and Mexico and Russia and bring them here, and we've been doing that.
Steve says that we can bring the best minds here, but that's no longer so easy, is it? Thomas Friedman in the New York Times once again. He's writing about a trip he made to Silicon Valley. Quote, executives complained bitterly that the Department of Homeland Security is making it so hard for legitimate foreigners to get visas to study or work in America that many have given up the age-old dream of coming here. Instead, they're studying in England and other Western European nations and even China. Close quote.
That's not exactly right. Actually, what's happening is they're still coming here to get their degrees, but then they can't get visas to stay here. So there are hundreds of thousands of very highly technically trained scientists and engineers who can't get a visa to stay.
It's just a little problem that the new Department of Homeland Security is going to work out in a matter of months or a year or so as they sort out the war on terror, or is this actually a kind of systemic thing that's undermining our ability to compete?
It's an easy problem to fix. In theory. In practice, it may be trickier because of the political dynamic, where a lot of people in the U.S. are scared and insecure, and that leads to anti-immigration policies. So I think you have to keep in mind on the political dynamic, but the policy is very easy to fix. You just grant more H-1B visas.
I agree with that, but I want to correct something I think you said, or someone said, which is that it's just staying with a visa after you've been educated. If you look at the applications for entrance to universities and the acceptance and the ability of people to come from foreign countries to the U.S. for our graduate schools, which has been the source of this foreign technical talent, that's down, and that's continuing to go down. And some of our best friends,
because of the war on terror,
getting a visa to come here.
Easy to get in.
You go to Australia today, you go to the UK today, you find major advertising and marketing campaigns. Why go to the U.S.? Why battle to get a visa to go to the U.S.? Come here for your education. Now, what that does is it siphons away some of the best students, It also creates then the lifelong contact of those students with the country where they've been educated, even if they go back home. That's depriving the U.S. twice.
Third topic here is big government. He's already said that he wants more basic research funded. You have an interesting twist on this, Stephen. I quote you from National Review. A strong argument can be made that the rush to re-regulate corporate America is precisely what is holding us back. Would you care to explain this?
Well, I think you see this, something we're talking about off the show was this new regulation with respect to corporate finances, Sarbanes-Oxley. And this is a bill that has imposed, potentially billions of dollars of costs on corporations. It's made it difficult for corporations to recruit people to their boards and so on because they're so draconian. I think that kind of re-regulation of corporate America can be very harmful to our ability to compete. And if we're going to have our corporations like Intel be the best in the world, we've got to make sure that we're not over-regulating them, that we're not burdening them with lawsuits, that we're putting kids in when they get out of school, they can read their degrees. All these things are pretty easy to solve. We know the solution. We just can't get the political system to respond.
Even as China and India are progressively getting their government out of the marketplace, freeing up the markets, ours is proliferating regulations, and over the long term, that is a serious matter that undermines our competitiveness. True, false?
If it's true, it would definitely undermine our competitiveness. I think at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to regulate much more because of the competitiveness, and that's why if we're aware that we have to compete with China and India, that is going to prevent the government from getting much more.
Trial lawyers are I mean, do you all agree that
it's at a limit? It is a huge problem, but it's not going to get any worse from here. It's at an absolute limit. The system is completely broken.
I hope it doesn't get any worse.
But that's a big net cost that we impose on our businesses that these other countries have much more rational.
This is an interesting dynamic that Peter has just suggested, that this is self-correcting.
Well, capitalism trumps
as long as
all.
we know it, as long as we're aware of it.
Capitalism trumps all in the world's economic infrastructure. And if you don't believe that, just look here in California. You just had a recall election in California. Capitalism trumped the incumbent governor and got him voted out of office. Why? 2 decades of oppressive environmental, business, economic restrictions on the growth of the economy here, choking it. And finally, the people rebelled. And if they can do it in California, my goodness, they can do it anywhere.
So if capitalism is self-correcting, then we don't really have to worry, right? This is going to correct itself over the longer term. All three of you, is that the case?
No, absolutely not. It only will correct itself if people are aware of the problem and they do things. Problems don't automatically solve themselves.
1950, I can't remember the year, but it was during the Eisenhower years. Richard Nixon visits Moscow, and he and Khrushchev get into a kind of informal debate, and Khrushchev famously pronounces, "We will bury you." No leader of China or India is going to be stupid enough to issue a direct challenge to the United States like that. By what mechanism is the political system in the United States going to recognize that it's under threat?
Well, the electorate won't tolerate falling behind. I mean, this is one of the reasons that we're Americans.
So? The British electorate
but Britain is a very different country than we are. And the point I made at the outset of the show is the American economic system of free markets is working. And my point is, who's the best at practicing the American economic system? We are. And I do think we're going to move towards these policies.
I think it's a close call. We've seen steel tariffs. We've seen re-regulation in lots of industries. It is a very close call.
Like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Or 2 back and 1 forward. It depends on whether you think people are going to think for the long term or the short term. And I think the jury's out.
Well, I get bothered when I look and see the federal government still putting $20 to $30 billion a year into agricultural subsidies and only putting $5 billion a year into basic research in the physical sciences. If you think that agriculture is the driving force for the U.S. economy in the 21st century, that's the right investment.
It was 100 years ago.
It was 100 years ago. It is not in the 21st century. We have our priorities backwards, and somehow we have to get that moved around. Now, the only way that'll happen is the populace has to get that message. Government leaders have to debate that message.
So is Intel, do you have a little arm for corporate philanthropy where you're going to be funding a think tank? Or what do you do?
The one extracurricular activity we have at Intel is, in fact, education, and it's improving both K through 12 education and providing research dollars at the university level, providing education to underprivileged kids. We put over $100 million a year into that. That's our one outside activity.
Gentlemen, alas, it's television, so I have to ask the final question. Ever since the middle of the last century, at least the middle of the last century, that is since the end of the Second World War, the United States has led the world in scientific research, in the commercial applications of technology, in overall technical and economic dynamism. Will the United States continue to lead the world by the middle of this century?
I think we will, and we have to if we want to remain number one. And that's going to mean improving our education and getting the foreign talent to come into this country that help build the Silicon Valley that Craig Barrett represents.
Peter.
Well, it's nothing automatic about history. History is made up by the choices people make, and it's in our hands to decide.
But you could quite easily see us going the way of England, a long, slow, comfortable decline.
It could be that, or it could be that America wakes up and stays number one.
Craig?
As my boss, Andy Grove, likes to say, only the paranoid survive. We are not paranoid about this topic in the United States today, and we have to get paranoid if you want us to be the leader 50 years from today. We have to do a lot more than we're doing now.
Craig Barrett, Peter Thiel, Steve Moore, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us. We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.